So in this lesson, we're going to talk about storage tables. Now, storage tables are an interesting feature of storage accounts. We know that we can have databases like SQL databases and Cosmos DB, but storage accounts themselves can actually store data. We go into the tables option within the storage account. Well, we'll see there's no tables by default, and we can very easily create one. So if we created a table called employees, then we would have a table that we can start to insert data into. Now, storage accounts are, we said before, publicly accessible by default, unless we tie this to a specific network using a network endpoint. So we can see here, creating the table has given it a URL that we can use for our programs. So essentially within our .NET programs or whatever language we use, this is basically how you would connect to this table. So let's have a look at how we would then use this table within our program. Switch over to Visual Studio. This is Visual Studio 2017. And I've created a new console app using the .NET Framework. Right now it's pretty empty. Now before we get into coding, we want to go to the NuGet package manager and manage NuGet packages for the solution. We don't have any NuGet packages, and so we're going to go over to the browse section. Now I'm going to find the Azure storage package. So there's going to be some official Microsoft packages for storage. We can see Windows Azure.storage being one. So we select Windows Azure Storage, and we're going to attach it to the project and choose the latest one and say install. Now we do have to accept some dependencies, and so we'll let it do that, accept the license. All right, so if we go back to the program, Microsoft Windows Azure Storage. The other framework class that we want to bring in is Microsoft Windows Azure Storage Tables. Table. Okay, so these are the two classes that we'll be concerned with. Now, in order to connect to Microsoft Azure and then access the table, we have to create what's called a client, right? So we have to start off with the cloud storage account and then get the cloud storage client, and then we can connect to the table. So we're going to get some code going that we can then connect to Microsoft Azure and connect to the table. All right, so we're going to start off by connecting to Microsoft Azure. We do this using the Cloud Storage Account class. And so we have to give it a name, call it Storage Account. Now we need a connection string to connect to this, okay? So I'm going to say Cloud Storage Account dot parse. Now in this parse command, we need to paste in the string that's used, basically the connection string. So if I go back to Azure, we have to find a way to connect to this account. Now there's a few ways, and I'm not going to get into detail right this second about the different ways that we can connect to it. We can certainly just I'm going to go to the access keys section, and one of the options they provide you is the connection string. So we're going to just skip right to copying the full connection string, going back to our program. Now I could put this in the app config file and get the connection manager. I'm going to just paste the connection string right into the code. Probably bad practice, but let's we're just demoing that we can manipulate with it right now. So next up, we've got let's assume that when this runs, we have a storage account variable that's instantiated. Now what we need is a client, right? So the client that we're going to use is the table client, the cloud table client. And in order to get that, we call the storage account option, the storage account object, and there is a method for each of them. Notice it's got blob, file, queue, and table. So we can get the table client directly from the storage account. So now we have a client that we can basically call to that table within the storage account and manipulate it. We can create tables, we can query tables, we can insert data. What we want to do is grab the table. We know we've created a table called employees, and so we're going to have to use the table client to get the table. So we're going to say, give me an object that represents the table employees. So now we have connected to the storage account, we have a client, and now we have an object that represents this table. Now the way that we get data into this table is we have to be working with objects. So to do that, I'm going to create an object in this same file, and it's going to be the employee object. So I'm going to say public class, and I'm going to call this employee entity. This is going to be the object that we're going to then insert into this table. Now this employee entity should derive from table entity. Okay, that's how Azure will know that this is supposed to represent a table. Now I'm going to make this very simple. We're just going to create a constructor. So the constructor has the same name as the entity. And this constructor will have take in two parameters. Let's call it first name, first, and last name. Okay, I'm just trying to make this as simple as possible. Now, every table has three mandatory fields. One of them is called partition key. So I'm going to say this dot partition key. Now, the partition key represents a sort of a class of object. I'm going to put it like that. Now this is an employee, but you might want to choose your partition key to be something that represents maybe the region they're from, or their class of employee, something that makes them, you're able to divide your employees into a handful of partition keys. Now you can also just hard code this to be person or staff, and every record has the same partition key. That's okay. So the easiest way to describe this would be, let's say you had millions and millions of records. At that level, Microsoft Azure might want to split your data into two parts to help make it easier to serve you. Well, the partition key would be the dividing line. Okay, so if your data had to be split, this would make sense to have this data over here and a different data over there. The unique identifier is called row key. So this is the primary key of the table. Now we could obviously create a GUI ID, some sort of a random date, including timestamp, including milliseconds. In this case, to make it as simple as possible, I'm just going to take the first name and the last name together with a space in between, and that will be my unique identifier. Now this is a bad coding practice, because what if you have two employees with the same first name and last name? But again, this is just an example. Now the final mandatory field is a timestamp, but it is not, Azure will actually have a default for it. So if we don't provide a timestamp, it will actually create one. So now we have a class that represents an employee. Very simple. So the question is, how do we get that object into the employees table? Well, first let's create an employee. Okay, we're going to call this employee number 1, and we're going to use the new keyword, And we know we can pass in the first name and last name. So I'm going to say Stanley as the first name and Jones as the last name. Okay, so now we have an object that we can say represents this employee. Now we need to get that employee into Azure. It takes 2 commands to do that. Now, the basis of working with Azure tables is the table operation. So whatever it is that you want to do, you want to insert, you want to update, you want to delete, you need to do a table operation in order to affect that. So I'm going to call this insert op. And so we're going to call let's see, I can see within the table operation class, insert, delete, insert or merge, merge, replace, retrieve. Those are the types of options, okay? So we're going to call this the insert operation, and what we're going to insert is employee number 1. Okay, so now we've built an operation, but it's not yet been sent to Azure. This is just sitting here on our computer as a insert operation of this object. The final step here then is to go back to our cloud table of employees and say execute. Okay, this is similar to the old style in .NET when you're working with local tables of building your query and then passing it in through the execute command through a command data access object. So what we want to execute is the insert op. This line is what's going to send it to Azure. Okay. So if I ran this, Stanley Jones object would be created and then sent to Azure for the employees table. So I'm going to just go and hit the start button. It's going to pop up for a console app for the briefest moment of time. And if we go back to Azure, then we should fairly easily go up to what's called Storage Explorer. So you scroll up and Storage Explorer is here. Go into it. We'll see into our storage account. So blobs, files, queues, we don't have any of those, but we have a table. Our table is called employees, and our employee is called Stanley Jones that we've inserted. So basically, we've shown that you can create a table in an Azure storage account using .NET code, connect to that storage account, insert data. You also should be able to retrieve the data as long as you know your partition key and your row key in order to retrieve that particular data. And in that way, we can see that Azure will now store this data. And since this is locally redundant storage, it actually stores 3 copies of it around the data center. All right.